Sounds good. Thanks a lot, James. Great to see you again. And
Likewise, Dan.
thanks for
Thank you.
thanks for joining us. Excited about this one. A great prep call, and I think there's just a ton of insight and value that you're going to bring to the entire Brand Innovators community today, in really an awesome role at a great organization in such an interesting time. I think just as to set the table a little bit, maybe ad nauseum, and a lot of these things we've talked about, the impact of all of the events that we experienced as a global community last year. But I think that the role of marketing, to me, has become even more prominent. We've taken on as marketers and companies that help to service marketers and being successful, a much broader role. It's helping to navigate these long time, very important brands in the community, in how they're received, but also just taking advantage and being very open and listening to the moment and being able to react to that in really meaningful ways and be the contributors to the community that we all want to be. We're not just kind of monolithic brands. We are woven into the communities that we operate in. And I think your team, and Wells really shined during what was probably the most challenging year, and a really interesting transitional time for you guys. So again, thrilled to have you here, thrilled to have this conversation, and really want to just dig into it. Anything that you wanted to say as a preamble to the conversation, or you want to dive into the content?
I know, just to thank you for that preamble. I think there'll be a lot of people proud to hear perception that we stepped up when much of the culture and country needed us to. So.
Yeah, and such a fascinating time, as we talked about. Wells is such a iconic brand, and certainly, the stagecoach and the colors are something that certainly folks in the West, but now that it's expanded and is really well permeated across the entire U.S. But as you joined, as we talked about the other day, it was a bit of a transition. It was a time to kind of rethink how the brand lived in market, how it was perceived by consumers, and it was a journey that you began, I think, back in 2018. And we'd love to just start there, of like what that, after coming out of a long, really successful career in the consumer electronics space, and then kind of moving into telco, what that looked like as you entered the fray in a very highly regulated industry, and one that is everybody uses every day, and kind of what that looked like as you were entering that journey with you and your team.
Well, I would love to share that. It was a fantastic journey so far. Entering a highly regulated industry, one that had a learning curve I would never have predicted. I perceived that some of my experience at Sony, and even some of the experience I had working on great brands like AOL and Yahoo as part of Verizon, that I'd experienced compliance, I'd experienced regulation, but I've never experienced regulation like we do in financial services. I joined Wells in February of 2018. That was a little less than 2 years into a moment in time that was really unique for this company. 170 years old, but a sales practice challenge that was uncovered in 2016 had the brand at its lowest point in trust in 170 years, like without a doubt. But I think I was set up for helping the company, and I hopefully helped the company in some meaningful ways. In kind of my approach to brand, I believe fundamentally that a brand exists here between people's ears, in their mind. And that when someone sees a logo, hears a name, like sees something that reminds them of a brand, what they think of as the brand, that is the reality of a brand. So knowing that, like, have to understand that there's a really intentional way to build perception through the combination of what you say and what you do. And what you say and what you do needs to be inextricably linked. You can't have a say-do gap. And we had a say-do gap probably in the most significant way. We were literally found to be doing the opposite of what we were saying. Not just a gap, but like completely inverted. And at the most macro sense, and most macro of scales, since we proudly serve 1 in 3 households and 10% of middle market companies and small business in the US, we had a significant say-do gap with all these people. But however, sales practice issues aside, and that say-do gap, we had a number of micro say-do gaps. We were saying that we were innovating digital banking, but our logo literally didn't render well on a mobile device. In fact, I learned that our logo prior to the release in 2019 was last designed in 1998, like pre-Y2K. So how would we ever have expected our logo to be rendering in a way that perceives? So we had micro and macro kind of say-do gaps. And I think my experience in my journey prior to Wells Fargo helped me really evaluate these different gaps and think about how to help the company close them. Either help the company evolve what we're saying or show up and deliver experiences that are more closely linked to what we're saying.
Yeah, and it was interesting. I mean, we talked about that's a daunting task to even go through and do the diligence to uncover all of those things, to know what the starting line is. I think you've got a good sense of kind of where the destination of the finish line was, but coming in and starting to unpack all those things. What was key for you in developing the relationships with your colleagues and starting to set the tone of how we're going to operate and start to clean those things up, but also just going forward, this is going to be our structure, this is going to be our charter, and how we achieve and get to that finish line?
I think a lot of my naivete in the industry, being new to the industry, it gave me the permission to ask questions that maybe others wanted to ask but didn't feel like they could ask because they should know the answers. But I can ask them and people don't expect me to know the answers. So I was able to guide a lot of conversations through inquiry. I helped the company look deeply at drivers of acquisition and retention in our industry, not something we had looked at so deeply through growth and history. And how do we make sure that we can really appreciate that we are called financial services for a reason? We are commoditized, and our products, what we want to call products, are really services for customers that we need to make sure that we deliver really good services and good value. It also allowed me to come in and question things that maybe hadn't been questioned before. Things traditionally like visual and verbal identity. Like, why is our tone and voice showing up in this manner? Do we really want to sound like this? It also allowed me to have an appreciation for where there's deep equity. You mentioned like colors. We're a red and yellow brand. I'm not sure there are many in this brand marketing community that would, of brand innovators, that would ever define a brand from scratch and say, I want a brand that's red and yellow. But I had a brand that was red and yellow, and for decades and more than a century, there's equity built in that. So do you double down and figure out how to make that work so that you don't feel like other brands that own those colors? And I think we really found a way to do that. And I was also able to come in and ask questions about some really highly emotional parts of our brand, some of our customer service aspects, the stagecoach. And I think I was fortunately in a position to be given the leeway to ask those questions and then uncover and help guide in some direction.
Yeah. So with that diligence, and as you kind of arrived on, what the sentiment, the personal, the emotional, the operational, how did you start to lay the groundwork for making those brand changes, to start making kind of material progress and moving towards reorienting how consumers think about how they experience the brand?
Align on some principles that we could all agree we wanted to be. Whether we were delivering a product or a service, or we were showing someone an advertisement and wanted them to react to what they digested in that 30 seconds. Like, let's commit to some principles. And allowed us to reframe some approaches. So from a design perspective, we said to ourselves, if we know we had this gap and our brand was designed again in like 1998, prior to that, let's leapfrog. Let's design first for mobile and then figure out how to make business cards work. Let's match like offline color to online what I see on the screen, which is like the opposite of what I had done in every other part of my career. Start to make sure you love what someone brought as a beautiful printout on their boards to your meeting, and then figure out how to replicate it digitally. We did the inverse. And I think it really allowed us to understand the value of like, how does what was ketchup and mustard become really bright and optimistic reds and yellows? It also allowed the people in the company to see that our logo itself, our iconic symbol of a stagecoach, may not be as meaningful as we thought, or might hold us back. And we could see that both through testing and deep customer research, but you could also see it when you're designing for something that was like so antiquated for the mobile space. So I think some of these principles of like really innovating the brand and designing the brand in a very different way was a big part of that.
Yeah, and it's the serendipity of decisions that you make as foundational, and then you're faced with a complete change in societal behavior. We're no
Yeah.
longer allowed to go to banks. We can no longer interact physically with the brands in a geo perspective, and we're forced to do everything via mobile. Kind of met consumers where they were in an unintended fashion. How did that kind of accelerate where you had seen, how consumers perceive the brand, but how they interacted? You just kind of took us through having that kind of digital orientation from the start. How did that then align with just the change in society and the experience in the last 18 months?
Yeah, well, there's a few things. We had done some. We didn't know. I don't think any of us could have predicted what we've gone through the last 18 months, but we had some foundation. We really started to think through how do we value and measure trust differently. We broke down trust in really human ways. We have a framework internally we like to reference. We call it 3 C's of trust. It's competence, character, caring. How do you make sure that you're delivering the best products and services? So that's your competence. How do you make sure you're continuously demonstrating integrity and ethics? That's a place we really needed work, character. And then caring, how do you show empathy and interest in the customers and employees? And when we were able to like understand that deeply, it allowed us to really think through what impact the pandemic was having on folks. So, we leaned into really quickly having to understand what are the psychographic components of what is happening to people. We really were able to sit back and say, where are our customers or employees on this journey? Last March, it was confusion. It was fear, right? We were hoarding toilet paper. It's kind of crazy, but like, we didn't know what else to do. So we actually projected out multiple phases of a recovery, not linked to time, because we didn't know the time scale. Right. But we knew as humans, eventually we would hit rock bottom. Eventually, hopefully things would turn around. We'd have optimism and we'd be on a path to a future. And we kind of tried to lay out some psychographic components of recovery. And then we did it for different audiences, B2C, B2B. And then actually very quickly, I would say by like mid-April, we learned it was going to be different in New York versus Florida versus California. And like take the, political commentary away and jokes from that. Literally the states had their own rules. So we had to then look at the psychographic dimensions, and our dimension of time became more a dimension of geography that defined time. So we had to put a lot of art to our data so that we knew we weren't showing up. Because the last thing we want to do is someone's worried about making their mortgage payment next week, and we show up with an ad that says, here's our new rates, you should refi. That would be completely not in any of the 3 C's. Yeah. So we had to make some smart choices like a lot of companies did. Let's turn off all BAU advertising until we figure it out. Let's turn it back on only when we knew we had the right thing to say. So those are some of the operations that we did.
Yeah. I know we didn't chat about this, but just curious on that last comment. I think it really speaks to also the relationships that you have with your third parties. Because to control that kind of knowledge, that kind of awareness and all of that thinking internally isn't easy, but easier. What were some of the ways that you had your vendors and your partners lean in so there was a good kind of symbiotic relationship as you were thinking that the implementation happened seamlessly and kind of kept to the strategy that you put in place? Just curious on any highlights or anecdotal stories about how that worked.
Yeah, I don't know if we ever like use this word, because I don't think it was, but it's the closest word I can come up with right now, Dan, because with that question, we sort of like war roomed from the scratch with our partners. Yeah. Even that psychographic recovery, we developed that with a creative ad agency, media agency, and strategy partners all working on it together. It wasn't from like one insights partner that said, here's a recovery. Like we interrogated it from all the different angles that we had to. So I would say like immediately we knew we were going to be smarter and better with our partners. And fortunately, we have some fantastic partners in BBDO and Siegel and Gale from a brand, and we have some fantastic, really strategic writing folks at Maslansky. A lot of strong Omnicom partners, largely with us. But we were able to make these decisions together, and they made a lot of recommendations that informed the decisions we made.
Yeah, I think that's a good illustration of how the ecosystem comes together, and you really get a deep understanding of those partnerships, the long-term value, and kind of the strategic impact, and how that partnership plays out. We were chatting about some of the things that were, I think, not directly, as I mentioned in the onset of the conversation, that marketing, I feel like the role and the scope has just expanded so significantly. And we talked about a few projects that really made an impact and resonated with me, specifically about how you were managing new things like PPP, and ways that the government was stepping in to support the economy and support small businesses as kind of the lifeblood of the economy. It'd be great if you could kind of touch on how you approach that, and how that was a big, I think, a corporate decision, but how that really aligned with your journey that you were on, to how consumers thought about the brand, and sticking with that as a practice and not just as a marketing campaign.
Yeah, there was a lot of things we had to think about doing differently. Our customers, the country, the world needed us to, right? We do fundamentally understand the value of a big financial institution is ultimately to enrich people's lives, or it should be. And enrichment took a different form during the pandemic. It took a form of accommodation for loan and payment relief, where typically there are fees and costs associated with a late fee or missing a payment. And we had to figure out how to make sure that didn't happen, right? Those sources of quote unquote maybe revenue of the past couldn't be now, because that wouldn't be enriching the lives of the people that are truly hurt the most. We were also asked to step up, as many other financial institutions were, and help the government execute the Paycheck Protection Program. And we wanted to make sure that we use these moments to be really more enriching moments. And one of the things that we did with Payment Protection Program is, all of this isn't just for Wells Fargo, but anyone that processed a loan for PPP, there was a fee associated with it. We didn't define it, the government defined it, that were to be collected by the financial institutions for processing the loans on the behalf of the government. And one of the things that we did is that we donated all gross processing fees from the Payment Protection Program. It's about $420 million to date. We put that back to work in the industry. We took no profit off of that fund. So we created an Open for Business fund. The Open for Business fund empowers small businesses that with technical assistance, long-term resiliency programs, sometimes cash infusion. We worked with local communities and nonprofits to make sure the money went to the most impacted small businesses, which happened to be the more diverse, ethnically, racially diverse, and female-owned small businesses. They were impacted the most during this. We worked with community leaders to make sure it was executed at a local level, because many of those diverse-owned businesses, their needs and their infrastructure are local. They may not be nationally digitally savvy the way bigger businesses are. So that was one of the things that we really did. And then now, a year later from that, because it's crazy to say, it was May last year when PPP started. We started a campaign in market 3 weeks ago. The tagline is "We made a way together," and we're now celebrating the successes of these small businesses that we also supported. And we are celebrating the success by highlighting the small business owners, the names of the small businesses. Our media is being media that's translating into awareness and logo visibility for these small businesses in their local markets. It's a hyper-local execution, a lot of digital lead. So we're just really proud to have been a part of it. And now we're able to say that, like, we feel like we were a part of their success. And we really were a part of their success, because it was the small business owners' resiliency that really created such an opportunity, and we were just happy to be able to support it.
Yeah, it's a great organic way to create stories that resonate and really support the brand journey that that you and the company are on, in a very important, customer constituency, but also, a way to really start to have the brand resonate in a more, emotional fashion, and not in a commoditized. Through that experience, what did, were there some big lessons, good takeaways for you and the team, that you think could be applicable in kind of the normal course of business? These were things that were acute market changes that you had to make changes, you had to react to. But is there anything that then kind of just changes fundamentally how you operate, as a leader, but also as marketers going forward?
Yeah, I think we're still digesting and learning a lot of that, but it has its, some benefits are that folks that were maybe resilient to agile approaches aren't any longer. They now see the value of being able to be nimble and possibly have agile PMO set up, because we do need to be able to turn and work quickly on a dime. I think it also showed a lot of the value of committing to long-term strategies and knowing what decisions to make near term, but not lose sight of long-term. I think one of the things I've observed throughout my career, certainly observed it firsthand at Wells Fargo, trust it's lost in buckets and gained in droplets. So when you go through a challenge like Wells Fargo has, and you have such a level of distrust that we once had and we still continue to come back from, you're not going to come back overnight. Look at case studies like British Petroleum, BP, J&J with Tylenol. It took years or decades for those brands to come back anywhere near the levels. And I think we understand we're on that journey as well. But knowing what our multi-year journey was, it allowed us to make decisions like, okay, we should do something with these processing fees. We should create this open for business fund. It allowed us to make those decisions quickly. It didn't take weeks of deliberation in a boardroom about creating this fund. These things were able to create it. These concepts were created in hours.
Yeah.
And that was really the thing that we're trying. Now we're trying to operationalize that in a BAU. I worry we're going to over processize it and create, productize it and create too much mechanism and lose some of the essence. But we are regulated, so we do have to have processes and compliance to things. So we even have to create a lot of process around agile. But I think we don't want to lose that mindset.
Yeah, that's great. You talked about, again, kind of the need during the last 18 months of really understanding the nuance of different regions, different markets, in the way that you bring that message to consumers in those individual areas, and also just the difference of where people are and what their experience is. As you think about that as a practice, deeper understanding of the consumer, deeper understanding of what's happening in those local markets as it relates to your paid marketing, and how that translates into the data that you use to arrive at those understandings, and then how that gets infused into the deployment of these marketing campaigns.
Yeah.
Anything that you would share with the audience today, and just best practices that you've learned that you're implementing as you go forward as it relates to data, and really getting to personalizing and getting crisp on the message, the right message to the right audiences?
Yeah, I think one of the primary things I'll comment, and this is not unique, so I actually feel silly saying it, but you need stronger narratives and more creative ways to message if you do want to be deeply targeting. Because I can't deeply target Dan Ackerman the way I would deeply target James O'Leary. It's not going to feel authentic.
Yeah.
So really being able to understand that while the data might help you really focus in on key areas and meet people where they are, you also have to be much more intelligent about how you do show up. And I think that's an area where there's a lot of opportunity, and we've had a fantastic opportunity to bring great experience from people who spent their careers in PR that can now lean into marketing, because a lot of the muscle memory that they had from PR can be applied to narratives that are needed for marketing execution. So there's a lot of blurring of like comms, marketing, PR, things are coming together. So we aspire to be much more targeted. We aspire to be much better about our targeting, but I think we've learned the strength and the need for narratives and for storytelling.
Yeah, which creates, I guess, even more challenges and complexity as you get that storytelling becomes more diverse and more targeted. It's definitely a creative challenge. So just interested in as you go forward on that brand journey, and you're 3 years into it. As you look towards the now and kind of we have some light at the end of the tunnel in the recovery, where do you think there's opportunity for organizations to not lose that agile nature and those lessons? You're in a regulated industry and you've got to apply a lot of process, but just in terms of advice and kind of thought, like maybe put yourself back in your Sony days or in your Verizon days, some of those fundamentals that were created and developed during this time but are really important to persist because the market's essentially changed forever.
Yeah, I think some of the things I've learned from observing what some of the small businesses we've been able to work with have pivoted, deeply understanding the value you create and what drives trust in your brand. Mm-hmm. Like understanding it at like a really, really committed level where you're honest with yourself. Because if you need to pivot, you need to make sure you pivot without losing that. If you pivot away from your core, you could be completely disrupted. So I think I've really started to appreciate the value of like trying to commit to what your drivers are. The other thing I've personally embraced a lot is, I've had a number of people say this to me throughout my career, and I've packaged it in this manner, which is I'm kind of equal parts delusional and practical. And I've got to embrace that because I want to be able to think big and be delusional, but I have to be able to execute. If I can't deliver, my value is not going to be there for the company. So that's something I've really kind of embraced. How do I make sure that I can know when to dial those up and then those down? And then something that I fortunately have always had, because even when I was agency side, I was working on some of the best CPG brands. But then when I first came client side to Sony, like innovation's kind of part of what I do, and questioning everything and thinking about how to do something differently, even if it's working. It's just kind of how my mind works. And I think that's a tremendous value to always have on. And I think if anyone can have that on for their brand, they're always going to be ready for a disruption that might occur. I look back on the last year at Wells Fargo, and one of the things that I'm really proud of is the industry, not just Wells Fargo, that this is an industry, this is the only industry I've been in where it is such an emotional topic, finances, yet the emotional connection that you have with your institution is so low. People have a higher emotional connection with Pepsi than they do their bank, which is wild in thought, but it's very practical in the reality. And when we look back on data that we get from partners, and there was a good JD Power survey last week, that 3/4 of people feel like their bank stepped up to help them. And 90% of those people are now committed to staying with their bank longer than they would have been because of the last year. So as an industry that's typically not really connected in an emotional way, that's a really emotional set of data to get back. And that's just something I'm really proud of, that a lot of our industry stood up together.
Yeah, I think this term kind of meeting, consumers or meeting people where they are is pretty prominent, and those brands that kind of stepped up and did that, I think the positive ripples and the long-term effect of that'll be felt for a while. On that topic, there's also the internal component, our leadership and the way that we engage and meet our teammates and our employees where they are. You guys are on this big kind of brand transformation journey, and then kind of reacting and proactively navigating through the pandemic. Not easy to do when you have teams not only distributed around the country, but no longer in offices together. But what were some of the experiences that you had and ways that you kept that good connectivity between the team to be able to step up and move fast and be agile and do things that clearly resonated with the marketplace?
Yeah, I mean, I might be off on these numbers a little bit, but we've got about 250,000 employees. About 200,000 are still working from home or not in offices. About 50,000 never went home because they were frontline. They're in branches servicing people. So we have a fantastic amount of gratitude for our employees who stayed safe, stayed on the front lines, and were essential workers in their own right. But also the 200,000 people that went home, that's bigger than many cities. I think 250,000 people would be like a top 100 city in the US. So our leadership team in technology, I don't know how they figured it out, but seemingly overnight, they figured out how to get that many people on communication services, on video. We've been able to figure out how to be as human as possible in this dimension, where clearly we have video fatigue like many of us have, but it's a benefit. We've been able to try to find a way to make sure that we all remember we are human. I manage people that lost family members to the illness. I lost a family member to the illness. I just had another team member still last week lose her father to the illness. So we are very human, and we have to be there to support each other. One of the things that we were really able to do is everyone has defined roles. They have defined, we call them MBOs, KPIs, how your success is as an employee.
Yeah.
But we had to create a culture where people could step in for each other. And I have team members that for the last 12 months did stuff dramatically different than were on their MBOs 15 months ago, but we needed to figure that out. They needed to step in. We needed to figure out how to be a team. So I think just trying to figure out how to help all of our employees understand that we're going to get through this together as a community. And then also allow people to show up and just have a good day, have a bad day. I think, I tried to create forums for conversation, open and honest forums for conversation. But I also, as a leader, have bad days. And I'm sure there's a dozen people that I work with that are listening to this right now and said, James was not, the most empathetic on this day in September when I needed him. But I hope that I had more of those moments that were empathetic than weren't, because that's what we were trying to create together.
Yeah, I mean, it's I always try to look at things glass half full, and I think it's one of the most probably lasting impacts of that experience is just the depth of the relationships, and out of necessity, creating trust where people and kind of demonstrating their ability to really step up and go way beyond the bounds of their remit or the bounds of their, the things that they're incentivized to do, MBOs, whatever those incentives are. So yeah, it's awesome to hear. And, it sounds like with a big organization and big challenge that is really coming together and probably shape the way you look at new additions to your team. In thinking about those attributes and those fundamentals, can they do that same thing and kind of contribute in a similar fashion? Just a last couple things, and I think we're going to move on to Q&A. But in terms of, we talked a little bit about mechanisms to kind of to measure, how things are resonating with consumers, and as you put all of these different stages of this brand transformation. Anything that you can, share with the audience around, good mechanisms that have helped to kind of be a gauge for, success on those?
Yeah, so we've got an ecosystem of mechanisms, I would say. We've got longer term metrics of trust. We've got nearer term metrics of trust, like our contribution to those 3 C's. Long-term trust being truly about a metric of trust. And then we've got really near-term metrics of performance of activities, whether it's a campaign or an experience we've created. Yeah. And how do we make sure that they are laddering, they are feeding back? We try to deploy a few different things. Nearer term, we look at traditional campaign things, exposed, unexposed. Did we create a lift? We also look at NPS, which is a really important tool for us. We look at touchpoint NPS, so NPS of my actions on a mobile device, NPS of going into a branch. But then we've also created a relationship NPS, which crosses touchpoints. That's kind of a mid metric for us, if you will, where trust is a long term. So, I think we're constantly optimizing and look at new ways to measure, because one of the things that we need to make sure that we're always trying to figure out is which of these metrics are the indicators of business value. And we know if we can move a few basis points on trust, that it's got enormous business value long term. But what are those nearer term metrics that the brand can move, that can be a halo for the brand? It's a little easier when you have a campaign that's around a product or service. Like, did we get as much click through and volume? Did we get as much people interested in applying for those products? But when we're doing nearer term brand campaigns, how are we showing that there's a immediate impact? And the way that we kind of try to do that is through those exposed, unexposed lift metrics, and then try to show the narrative value near term, and hope that it's providing the long term value.
Yeah, it makes sense. There's so much conversation now about measurement and metrics and accountability of really everything across the business, but particularly in marketing. And certainly the consumer behavior is putting them in environments where, there is more data, there is more inputs and outputs to really understand the impact on, any stage of the marketing funnel, but even outside of that, like you're talking about, those kind of fundamental trust metrics and how that then relates down to business and, adoption of products and services. When you look on the kind of longer horizon, 2-3 years, in terms of, how you set the stage for, continually pushing the team to innovate and to think about, how do we start to even be more proactive in getting ahead so we can be prepared for things like we experience, but more importantly, in a competitive industry, how you can start to, to differentiate. What would you say are kind of fundamentals for raising above the tactical and thinking about, innovation on that longer horizon?
Trying to make sure we have the right people and processes in play. How do we make sure that we have got people focused on being able to react in the moment, but understand the implications of those reactions down the line, and the processes that will allow people to react quickly and get to market quickly. So a lot of that agile mindset, but really around people and processes. I think we can get much better in that whole notion of targeting. How are we targeting? When are we targeting? What is the experience we're creating in a really highly targeted communication? Some of that comes in people and process, but a lot of it comes in just our comfort level with the creativity, with the message that we want to deliver. As a bank, we have to deliver messages sometimes that say, you didn't qualify for this loan, sorry. But should we communicate, sorry, you didn't qualify for this loan, sorry? Or here's how we can help you maybe get to a point of qualifying. And do we have the infrastructure and service to help with that? So we've got to really think about how to be highly targeted in a meaningful way. And then the last thing that we're excited about, which feels very insignificant compared to those 2 points, but I think is really powerful, is we haven't unlocked the scale and volume of how to leverage influencers. And I think in an industry where we have such a relationship challenge in terms of emotional investment people have with their relationship with their bank, influencers can be a really powerful tool. And I think we're trying to figure out both the compliance and process side of it, which we need to do as a bank, but also how do we leverage the right influencers in the right way? And that's something we're excited about, but we know we're really at the infancy of.
Yeah, well, it sounds like you may have some organic influencers in the small and medium businesses that were helped and really impacted through that. But yeah, it's a whole new frontier, especially in that industry. But to your point earlier about the emotional connection to a soft drink is greater than to your financial institution, even though it taps into all of the heartstrings of everything you do. So that'll be a really interesting journey, and looking forward to maybe seeing some results of that the next time we connect. Seeing a lot of questions that I think we've already answered. I know we only have 3 minutes left, so I would encourage everybody who's tuned in here to put questions into the Q&A. We did have one that just came in, so thank you. So just reading through this for a second. So do you think Wells and the industry learned from the execution of kind of marketing through the 2008 crisis, by demonstrating leadership and compassion, by reinvesting from the COVID relief loans? How do you think that goodwill is done organically, and how do you think that plays into the brand scoring? hopefully I've captured that question right.
Yeah, I mean that's a tough one for me to answer given my tenure in the industry, but I do feel like I've been a part of a lot of conversations with colleagues who were around in 2008, and I think they do understand more about the role we play in enriching people's lives much more now than 2 decades ago. So I have confidence in that, but I can't really speak to that, like the correlation directly.
Got it. Got it. Well, I know we're coming up, and David will probably be swooping back in. James, I'm really appreciative of the transparency, but also the detail and the real personal connection to the stuff that you guys are working on. As a consumer, certainly resonates. Have been seeing the change, especially here in the home market in San Francisco, where the Stagecoach and the original branding definitely have a much more personal connection to the community. But really impressed and want to keep watching as a fan from the sidelines as you and your team continue through that journey. So thank you so much for the time. Thanks for
Yeah, thank
all
you
of
for having me.
really appreciate it.
This was great, guys. Thank you both. Definitely a lot of fantastic topics covered. I keep going back to, this idea that you talked about, James, a little bit earlier on about, you can have all the data, the right person, the right time, the right place, but without the right narrative or the right messaging, you maybe aren't taking full advantage of that data. And, in light of the upcoming cookie deprecation and things like that, and its impact on the data that we have and the targeting opportunities is going to make that messaging all that much more important. So, love that point, and really looking forward to seeing, like you said, Dan, on the influencer side, how that takes off in such a highly regulated industry. And definitely these days on TikTok alone, I see a lot of content around mortgage hacks, investment hacks, loan hacks, and the way that it kind of sometimes feels like a natural fit for a platform like that, more so than Instagram and things like that. So definitely will be interesting to see how things develop. But again, this was fantastic. So Dan, James, thank you both so much for joining and sharing with us.